The glove appeared first. That is how this story begins. Not with declarations or proposals, not with a grand estate or a title spoken in hushed reverence, but with one small article of women's dress lying abandoned on the lacquered floor of the Millbrook assembly room on a cold Friday evening in November. Kid leather, pale as new cream, worn at the thumb's edge from years of careful use. At the wrist, worked in silver thread so fine it had faded to the colour of moonlight on standing water, ran a chain of small, linked hearts, each one open at the top, as if mid-stride, as if running somewhere urgent. It was a woman's left glove, and it was alone, and for the moment it lay there unregarded among the scuffled heels and trailing hems of 36 people who had not yet understood that they were witnesses. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let me tell you about the woman who wore it first. Millbrook was not a place where extraordinary things happened. The western town had a modest high street, a coaching inn called the White Hare, a small lending library above the chandler's shop, and approximately one notable gathering per month at the assembly rooms above the Guildhall. The population was large enough to sustain gossip and small enough to be thoroughly exhausted by it. November brought early dark and wood smoke from a dozen chimneys, and the particular restlessness of a town that has run out of new things to say about itself. Cordelia Reed lived in a narrow house on Holt Lane, 3 streets from the assembly rooms. In 2 rooms she shared with Mrs. Edith Alcott, the widow of a minor clergyman, who required the services of a companion as constantly and inventively as she required remedies for her nerves. Mrs. Alcott was not unkind. She was merely inexhaustible. Her complaints about the kitchen fire, the damp in the lower hall, the impudence of the butcher's boy, and the inadequacy of the apothecary's latest preparation arrived in a steady, undifferentiated stream from 7 in the morning until Mrs. Alcott finally consented to sleep. Cordelia managed all of it: the household accounts, the weekly correspondence, the medicinal teas, and the twice-weekly airing of the widow's collection of fading silk shawls. She did this competently, quietly, and with an expression that her neighbours described as pleasant and her acquaintances described as guarded. She was 24 years old. She had been companion to Mrs. Alcott for 3 years. Before that, she had been other things, but she did not speak of them. She allowed herself 2 small extravagances. One was a subscription to the lending library, where she borrowed volumes of natural history and occasionally novels, with the covers turned face down when she carried them home through the street. The second was her mother's gloves. There were 2 of them, a matched pair in kid leather, pale and fine, the kind of thing that had once been purchased without a second thought from a glover on Bond Street. Her mother, Charlotte Harton, had worn them to her own wedding, to her own daughter's christening, to the last garden party at Harton Hall, before consumption had taken her. When Cordelia had been sent away at 8 years old, bundled into a post-chaise at dawn, with a small trunk and a nurse named Dorcas, who clutched a tapestry bag to her chest with white-knuckled hands, the gloves had been folded into Cordelia's small fist by Dorcas herself, along with 3 whispered words: "Do not lose them." She had not. Not in 16 years, not through a succession of modest situations and rented rooms, not through the letter from her uncle Horatio Harton informing anyone who might ask that his niece Cordelia had died of a fever the previous winter and was kindly to be remembered in one's prayers. She had read that letter in a lodging house in Bath, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, and when she had finished reading it, she had folded it once, precisely, and placed it inside the right-hand glove, where it remained to this day, the record of her legal erasure tucked inside the one object that proved she had ever existed. She was not dead. She was in Millbrook. She was being paid £11 per annum to read correspondence aloud to Mrs. Alcott, and she was doing her level best not to be found. The assembly on the 14th of November was larger than usual because of the Duke. His name was Edmund Ashworth, 6th Duke of Chasewood, and he had arrived 2 days prior at the White Hare, with a travelling carriage, 2 outriders, a valet named Perrin, who moved through rooms with the silent efficiency of a man employed to anticipate problems before they could form, and a general air of a man fulfilling an obligation he found faintly irritating. He was 31, dark-haired, lean in the way of men who walk more than they ride, and possessed of a particular quality of stillness in company that could be mistaken for boredom by those who did not look closely enough. He had come to the neighbourhood at the invitation of Sir Robert Grantham, whose daughter Amelia was considered the season's finest matrimonial prospect in 3 western counties, and whose father had made it discreetly known, through the careful intermediary of a mutual acquaintance at his club, that a title would be warmly welcomed into the family. Millbrook had reacted to his presence as a pond reacts to a stone dropped at its centre. The concentric rings of preparation spread outward from the moment of his arrival. New ribbon trim was ordered from the drapers. 6 dinner invitations were composed, and then reconsidered, and then sent. And Mrs. Harriet Polwarth, who chaired the Assembly Committee, personally supervised the refurbishment of the 2 large candelabras above the dancing floor, replacing every clouded drop crystal with fresh, polished glass, so that the light fell clean and flattering on the evening's company. Cordelia heard about all of this from Mrs. Olcott, who had opinions about dukes in general, and about this one in particular, based on approximately nothing. She accompanied the widow to the assembly because Mrs. Olcott required her arm on the stairs, and because there was a new volume waiting at the library, dispatched to her on approval from the lending service, that she had not yet collected, and the assembly rooms shared a landing with the Guildhall's upper floor, where packages were occasionally left. She wore her grey wool dress, which was neat and well brushed, with a narrow black velvet ribbon at the collar, that she had moved from an older dress when that one had finally given out at the seams. She wore her mother's gloves. They were the finest thing about her appearance by some distance, and she was aware of this, and she did not especially care. They fit as gloves fit when they have been made for a hand very like your own, and the silver hearts at the wrist caught the warm candlelight and ran. The Duke of Chasewood arrived at 8:30, accepted the effusive welcome of Sir Robert and Lady Grantham with the patience of a man who has accepted many such welcomes in many such rooms, and spent approximately 14 minutes in conversation with Miss Amelia Grantham before his attention drifted. Miss Amelia was everything she had been represented: fair-haired, composed, educated in the ways that were expected, equipped with a laugh that she deployed at intervals like a well-rehearsed piece of music. She was also, the Duke discovered quickly, entirely uninterested in anything he said that did not confirm the impression she had already formed of him. When he mentioned that the road through Dartmoor had been in better repair than he'd anticipated, she told him he was very brave. When he observed that the assembly room's plasterwork was in good condition for a building of its age, she told him he was very knowledgeable. He suspected that if he had confessed an interest in beetles, she would have told him he was very dedicated, and that this conversation would continue in that register indefinitely, each of his sentences transformed by her replies into a confirmation of his own estimable character. He thanked her, excused himself as graciously as he could manage, took a glass of claret from the tray a footman extended near the door, and drifted toward the far wall. She was standing beside the second window from the left, in a grey dress, reading. Not waiting to be approached, not performing interest in the painting that hung above the window alcove. Reading, with the mild concentration of someone who has found a better use for an unremarkable half-hour, and sees no social reason to disguise it. The book was small and cloth-bound, and from the angle at which she held it, the Duke could not make out the spine. Her hair was dark and simply dressed. A few pins, no ornament. Her gloves were extraordinary. He crossed the room. He could not have given a precise account of why. He had not crossed a room deliberately toward a woman in 2 years. And the last time he had done so, the consequence had been a broken engagement, a returned ring, and a brief season of particularly pointed gossip about what a duke's title was worth, when its holder proved insufficiently charming. He crossed it anyway. "I wonder," he said, "whether the book is worth the assembly, or whether the assembly is merely preferable to whatever you might otherwise have been reading at home." She looked up. Her eyes were grey, like her dress, like the November evening showing dark beyond the window glass, and they assessed him with a directness she made no effort to soften. "The book," she said, "is a commentary on ornamental plasterwork, which the lending library appears to have acquired by accident when the estate catalogue was dispersed. So the assembly has a slight advantage." She glanced at the ceiling. Slight. He looked at the cover. It was, in fact, descriptive notes on some specimens of decorative stucco, published 1804, by a Mr. T. Harcroft of Bath, who had presumably found an audience somewhere, though the Duke could not immediately identify where. He found himself unreasonably pleased. "Then we are both disappointed by the ceiling," he said. "I am not disappointed. I expected very little from it. Expectations properly calibrated are the foundation of a tolerable evening. That is either wisdom or defeat." "In my experience," she said, and something in her voice was older than her face, "it is very difficult to tell them apart in the moment. The difference only becomes clear afterward." Her name, she gave him when he asked, was Cordelia Reed, she told him, and watched him process the name the way people did, looking for something behind it, some connection to a family they knew, a neighbourhood they recognised, and finding nothing, as she had arranged for them to find nothing, for 3 years now. "Reed," he said, "an unremarkable name. Useful in certain respects. Are you often in need of an unremarkable name?" She considered this with the same candour she had applied to everything else. "I am in need of simplicity. I find it serves better than complexity in most situations." "I find the opposite," the Duke said. "Simplicity tends to be a very thin coat in a cold room. Complex problems dressed in simple language have a way of making themselves felt regardless." She looked at him with slightly more attention than she had given him before. Most men, when she said something they did not entirely understand, defaulted to one of 2 responses. They agreed with it reflexively, or they changed the subject. He had done neither. He had pushed back, not aggressively, but with the mild confidence of a man accustomed to testing the load-bearing capacity of an argument before committing weight to it. She filed this away, said nothing, and closed her book. The set was forming near the centre of the floor. Mrs. Polwarth's musicians, a pair of fiddles, and a gentleman at the pianoforte who performed with more enthusiasm than precision, had struck up a country dance, and the assembled company was arranging itself in 2 facing lines, with the communal good cheer that November, proximity, and the prospect of exercise jointly produced. Cordelia observed this from her position beside the window, with no particular intention of joining it. "Will you dance?" the Duke asked. "I am a companion," she said, "not a guest. Companions do not generally take up places in the set." "That appears to be a rule you have made, rather than one that appears in any book of manners I have read." "It is a practical rule. I am here to ensure Mrs. Alcott does not slip on the stairs, not to occupy the Duke of Chasewood's attention for the length of a country dance." "You are occupying it regardless. The dance would merely give the arrangement a socially legible frame." She studied him for a moment. Across the room, Cordelia was aware of Miss Amelia Grantham watching their exchange with an expression of politely restrained displeasure. Lady Grantham, beside her daughter, was less restrained. Her gaze had the fixed quality of a woman recalibrating a social situation and not yet arriving at a satisfactory new calculation. Mrs. Alcott, installed in a chair near the punch bowl with a shawl across her knees and a new conversational partner in the form of Mr. Tanner, the solicitor's wife, appeared oblivious. "A socially legible frame," Cordelia said. "That is a very precise description of a dance." "I am a precise person." I had formed that impression. She smoothed a finger along the spine of the closed book. "Very well. One set." The floor was warm from candlelight and movement. The Duke danced as he spoke, without flourish, without the performed grace of a man who wished to be observed doing it, with a competence that suggested he had simply learned the thing properly and then ceased to think about it. He took her right hand at the turn, and she noticed he held it correctly, firm enough to be certain, light enough to leave room for her own decision about how to follow. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. "You were not from Millbrook originally," he said, as they met in the centre. "No. Bath, I think, from the cadence. Or near Bath." She did not confirm or deny this. They parted for the figure, crossed, met again. The fiddles were in tolerable agreement with each other this evening. "You read books on plasterwork at assemblies," he said, when they were close enough to speak without raising their voices. "You describe simplicity as a tool rather than a preference. You appear to regard my title as neither an advantage nor a disadvantage, which I find," he paused for the turn, "genuinely unusual." "Most people find it one or the other," she agreed. "Every person I have met in the last 3 years has found it one or the other. You appear to find it approximately irrelevant." "What you are, on the basis of this conversation," she said, "is a man who pushes back on imprecise statements, holds a glass of claret he has not drunk, and asked a companion to dance, while being actively observed by the family who invited him here for the specific purpose of meeting their daughter. Your title is the least interesting thing about the current situation." He was quiet for one full figure. Then, "No one has said that to me in those words before." "I suspect no one has had occasion to." "I suspect you are right." She was smiling by the time they took hands for the final figure. She was not, in general, a woman who smiled at assemblies in Millbrook in November at 10 o'clock at night. The smile arrived anyway, small and a little surprised at itself, and she did not attempt to recall it. It was at the turn of the final figure, her left hand extended, his right meeting it, that she felt the change in the glove's fit. A loosening at the wrist, the small give of a fastening, that had finally, after 20 years of the seam's loyalty, released. She felt the glove slip. She did not feel it land. The music ended, the room dissolved into movement and chatter and the general resettling of company that concludes every country dance, and Cordelia, stepping back and curtsying, thought she would retrieve it in the next moment, before the next set began, while there was still a clear line of sight to the floor. She looked up first, by instinct, by the animal reflex of a woman who had spent 3 years looking for particular faces in rooms. He was across the floor, near the punch bowl. Horatio Harton, her uncle. He was heavier than she remembered, the extra weight of 16 years and comfortable living, but his face was unmistakable. The broad jaw, the high colour in the cheeks, the way he stood with his shoulders drawn back and his chin slightly elevated, as a man stands when he considers himself the tallest consequence in any room he occupies. He was laughing at something someone beside him had said. He wore a dark coat with silver buttons. In his lapel, the gold pin she remembered from childhood, a stag's head, Harton family device, which he had taken along with everything else he had taken and wore now with the ease of long possession. His eyes moved across the room the way his eyes had always moved, assessing, cataloguing, looking for something that might prove useful, or something that might prove inconvenient. They were moving toward her section of the floor. Cordelia did not think. Thought was a luxury she could not afford in this moment. She took 3 steps toward the door, then 4, and the crowd was thick enough near the refreshment table that she could pass through the edges of it without being conspicuous. She hoped. She prayed. She could not afford to look back and verify. She took her grey cloak from the peg at the entrance without stopping, pushed through the narrow side door that opened onto the landing, and went down the stairs into the November street with her heart doing something it had not done in a very long time. Absolute, unmanageable terror, arriving all at once like cold water. She did not stop at the lending library. She walked to Holt Lane in the dark, her breath short, her hands clasped in front of her. And it was only when she pushed open the door of her lodgings and climbed to her own room and stood with her back against the closed door in the thin light of the single tallow candle she left burning for her return, that she looked down at her hands and understood. Her left hand was bare. She had left the glove. The room was small and spare. A single bed with a grey blanket, a washstand with a white jug, a writing table where she kept the household accounts in a leather folder, and beside the folder a small tin box that held, among other things, her father's seal in cracked wax and a lock of dark hair tied with a faded blue ribbon. The room had, over 3 years, acquired the texture of her careful inhabiting. The books stacked by height on the narrow shelf above the bed, a sprig of dried lavender hung at the window frame to counter the damp smell from the walls in wet weather. The pair of her mother's gloves folded together on the corner of the washstand each night before she slept. Now there was one glove where there had been 2, lying on its side in the candlelight, and the sight of it, one where there should be 2, alone where it had never been alone, was somehow more terrible than all the rest of it, than the shock of the familiar face across the room, or the cold air of the street, or the sound of her own breathing all the way down Holt Lane. She sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed the heel of her right hand against her sternum. She thought, with the deliberateness of a woman who has learned to use deliberateness as a rope when everything else is falling. He did not see me. He was laughing. His eyes were moving, but they had not found me. He was there for the Granthams, or for someone at the assembly, not for her. Not yet. Not unless Slade had traced her to Millbrook and sent word. And if Slade had traced her to Millbrook, she would have had some warning, some sign. She had been careful. She was always careful. But she had not been careful enough tonight. She lay back on the narrow bed with her cloak still around her shoulders and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. In the assembly room, somewhat later than this, after the last set had finished and the company had thinned and Mrs. Polwarth's footman had begun to collect abandoned glasses from the window ledges and the tops of chairs, the Duke of Chasewood stood near the door with his own cloak on his arm and looked at what he held in his other hand. He had found it almost immediately, lying on the lacquered floor where the set had been, so small and pale against the dark wood that it would have been kicked under a chair within the next quarter hour and lost entirely. He had picked it up with the vague intention of returning it to its owner. He had then looked at his hand and understood, with the precision he applied to most things, that its owner was gone. He turned it in the light of the nearest candle. The leather was fine, finer than a companion's salary ought to purchase, worn with the softness that comes not from neglect, but from genuine, long use. He had worn his own dress gloves perhaps 100 times, and they had not acquired this quality. This glove had lived with someone. It had been worn and folded and preserved with some intention beyond mere utility, and at the wrist worked in silver thread that had faded nearly to white, so that you had to angle it toward the light to read it, a chain of small hearts, each one open at the top, each one linked to the next. Running. That was the word for it. Running hearts, the old term for that particular device. He had encountered it before, somewhere in the crowded archive of things he had read and filed and not immediately expected to need. He turned it once more. The running heart was not, in his experience, a common motif. It was not a trade device or a generic ornament. It had the specificity of a family crest. Perrin materialized at his shoulder with the quiet punctuality that justified his salary 3 times over. "The carriage is ready, Your Grace." In a moment. The Duke folded the glove carefully and placed it inside his breast pocket, against his coat. "Do you know who the woman in the grey dress was? Near the second window. Dark hair." Perrin's expression registered that he had indeed noticed the woman in the grey dress, as Perrin noticed most things in rooms he entered, and had formed the opinion that this question was likely to be forthcoming. "Her name is Miss Reed, I believe, Your Grace. She is companion to the widow Alcott on Holt Lane. She has been in Millbrook for 3 years or thereabouts." "Reed," the Duke said. "And before Millbrook?" "I could not say, Your Grace." "No," the Duke said, "but I expect someone could." He nodded once to Perrin, buttoned his coat against the cold waiting outside, and crossed the emptied floor toward the door, stepping precisely over the place on the lacquered boards where the glove had lain. Outside, the November street was dark and quiet, the white hare's lantern swinging slightly in the wind 200 yards up the road. The Duke walked to his carriage with the deliberate pace of a man who has just identified a question he intends to answer, and the particular shape of the running heart crest moved in his thoughts the whole way, restless and searching, as if it too were looking for something it had once known and lost. What family, in his memory, had run hearts at the wrist? And why had a companion on Holt Lane, in a worn grey dress, with no pretension and no social ambition, and a voice that had been schooled out of its regional cadence with considerable care, why had she been wearing their heirloom as if it were the only thing she owned worth keeping? The White Hare's reading room was too small for a duke and too cold for November, but it had one advantage the assembly rooms had lacked: a fire, a table, and no one asking him to be agreeable. The Duke of Chasewood spent the remainder of that evening and the first pale hour of Saturday morning with a glass of brandy he didn't want and his great-aunt's last letter, which he had been carrying in his travelling case since autumn because Lady Ursula Prentice wrote letters that rewarded rereading. She had the quality of a woman who had seen a great deal of English social life, from a considerable height for 81 years, and had stopped being surprised by any of it, which meant she was the most reliable intelligence he had on questions of family history and its discontents. He wrote to her before he slept, a short letter, precise in its question. What family used the running heart as its crest device, and what could she tell him about their present circumstances? He stayed 2 more days in Millbrook, on the pretext of reviewing some property east of the town that a solicitor in his employ had flagged as worth inspecting. Sir Robert Grantham took this extension of his visit as a very promising sign, and arranged a dinner. The Duke attended it, spoke to Miss Amelia Grantham for a further 40 minutes, and returned with increasing clarity to the conclusion he had already drawn the night of the assembly. He was looking for a woman in a grey dress, not a bride in white. Lady Ursula's reply arrived on Thursday, forwarded by express from London. She had written it on her customary blue paper, in a hand that remained formidably legible, despite what she referred to as the general insubordination of her right hand. She had, she said, been wondering when someone would ask. The running heart was the Harton device, belonging to the Harton family of Somerset, seated at Harton Hall for 6 generations. The late Edmund Harton, she wrote, and here her pen pressed harder, as it did when she felt strongly, had been a decent man without adequate defences against his younger brother Horatio, who had, upon Edmund's death 12 years ago, assumed control of the estate with a speed and completeness that she had found unseemly at the time and outright suspicious thereafter. There had been a daughter, Edmund's only child, born of his marriage to Charlotte Whitmore, who had herself died when the girl was small. The daughter had been sent away in Edmund's last illness. Ursula had heard a fever, or perhaps a removal to relatives. The story had shifted slightly in the telling, and was subsequently reported dead. Edmund Harton's will had never been produced. Lady Ursula was 81 years old, and had been writing letters about injustice into the general indifference of English society for 40 years, and she had developed the habit, in her later correspondence, of underlining the things she felt most needed to be acted upon. The sentence about the will was underlined twice. The Duke read this letter in the White Hare's reading room once, then folded it and held it in his hand for a moment with the stillness of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he had been half hoping to be wrong about. Cordelia Reed, with her careful simplicity and her worn grey dress, and her voice schooled out of its origins with such deliberate craft. A companion. Miss Reed. Not Miss Harton, not alive, legally speaking, living at the exact address Perrin had obtained, on Holt Lane, 3 streets from the assembly rooms, concealed in plain sight in a town that had no reason to look for her. He called Perrin and told him to have the carriage ready at 9. He did not yet know, going to Holt Lane that Friday morning, that he was already too late to be simply the first person who had found her. He did not know that 3 days before his letter reached Lady Ursula, a man named Slade had arrived in Millbrook at the coaching inn on the far side of the market square and begun asking questions about long-term residents of the town whose histories were not well established. He did not know this because Cordelia had not told anyone, not Mrs. Olcott, not the lending librarian, not the housekeeper at the rectory who sometimes took tea with her on Wednesdays. She had found out because a neighbour's boy named Alfred, who ran occasional errands between the coaching inns and the high street shops, had mentioned to her with the cheerful thoughtlessness of an 11-year-old that there was a gentleman at the Crown asking whether anyone knew a dark-haired woman who might go by a different name than the one she used. Alfred had thought this interesting but not alarming, because Alfred had no reason to connect it to Miss Reed, who was merely the kind lady from Holt Lane who lent him pennies when he forgot his lunch. Cordelia had thanked him, given him a coin, sent him on his way, gone inside, and stood in the hallway of Mrs. Olcott's house for 3 minutes without moving. Then she had gone upstairs and written 4 letters, sealed all of them, burned 3, and kept 1 to send to Dorcas. She was at her writing table when the Duke knocked. She heard the knock from upstairs, a firm knock, not the tentative tap of a tradesman or the nervous rhythm of Mrs. Olcott's usual callers, and something in its quality made her push back from the table before she had consciously decided to. She was at the top of the stairs when the maid opened the door and the Duke's voice said, in a register that carried upward with perfect clarity, that he wished to speak with Miss Reed on a private matter if she were available. Cordelia stood at the top of the staircase and thought, he found it. She came downstairs. She showed him into the small front parlour which smelled of Mrs. Olcott's lavender water and was furnished in the overcrowded style of a widow who had moved twice and could not quite bear to part with the sofa from the larger house. The Duke, in this room, with his dark coat and his particular quality of contained attention, occupied the available space as a fact rather than as a social performance. He did not sit until she invited him to. He placed his hat on the side table with deliberate care. He met her eyes. "I know who you are," he said. Cordelia had prepared approximately 14 responses for this moment over the past 3 years in the quiet of her room on various sleepless nights, ranging from flat denial through careful deflection to the absolute truth delivered in a single clear sentence. She found, now that the moment had arrived, that every prepared response felt like putting on a coat that no longer fit. "How much do you know?" she said instead. He told her. He told her about Lady Ursula's letter, the running heart, the missing will, the brother who had claimed an estate that was not his to claim. He told her about Slade at the Crown, which she had not known he knew. She watched his face as he said it, and he watched hers. And in this way they performed for each other the mutual audit of two people who have both been surprised to find someone else in possession of information they thought was private. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. Outside the parlour window, the Millbrook High Street was going about its ordinary Friday morning business. A cart with a load of timber, two women in conversation outside the drapers, a dog investigating something near the gutter, with the absorption of a dog who has nothing more pressing on its schedule. "What do you want?" she said. "To make a proposal, a practical one." He set his elbows on his knees and looked at her directly. "I need a wife by the end of the season, or my mother's sister will attempt to broker one for me, which I find an intolerable prospect. I need someone who will not mistake my title for a personality, which limits the field considerably. You need a name that Slade cannot touch, and lawyers who can move faster than your uncles. And you need them before he has you declared dead a second time in a court of law." He paused. "Those are the facts, as I understand them." A marriage of convenience solves several problems simultaneously. She was looking at him with the grey eyes he remembered from the assembly floor, and they were doing what they had done then, working through the calculation with an honesty that didn't bother to disguise itself as something more flattering. "And afterward?" she said. "When the inheritance is settled, when the season is done. A separate establishment, if you prefer it, a settlement that is yours regardless of what follows. I will not manage your money, your correspondence, or your time." "That last point," she said. "In writing." "In writing," he agreed. She stood and moved to the window. The draper's women had concluded their conversation. The dog had found what it was looking for and moved on, satisfied. Cordelia pressed the tip of one finger against the cool glass and thought about Horatio Harton's gold stag's head pin, worn with the ease of long possession. She thought about Slade at the Crown, asking questions, and the way Alfred had said it, cheerfully, innocently, as though it were a small, interesting detail, rather than a lit fuse. She thought about Dorcas, who was old now, and ill now, and who had carried the tapestry bag with the will sewn inside it through 16 years of silence, waiting for the right moment with the patience of a woman who had loved Cordelia's mother. "There is a condition on my side as well," she said, without turning from the window. "My nurse Dorcas held certain documents. She is in Bath. I will need access to her before anything else is formalised. That can be arranged." She turned. "You have not asked why I am in Millbrook, why I am a companion, what the intervening 16 years have looked like." "No," the Duke said. "I have not." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that indicated she was already learning, that he was choosing his words with precision rather than stalling. "Because the shape of the answer is clear enough from the evidence, and because I have found that pressing for narrative details before the person concerned is ready to give them is a form of impatience dressed as interest." He picked up his hat from the side table, turned it once. "When you wish to tell me, you will tell me." She had been waiting, she realised, for some version of the other thing. The version in which his practicality concealed a more ordinary kind of male authority. The kind that believed offer and acceptance were the same as understanding. She had been waiting for the small sentence that would reveal it, that implied she had been lucky, or that suggested she owed him something beyond the legal terms they had just sketched. It had not come. He had made a proposal, waited for her objections, accepted them without modification, and had not once looked at her as though she ought to be grateful. She thought about the way he had said, "I find an intolerable prospect," flatly, without drama, as though it were a logistical problem rather than a confession. and she thought about the broken engagement that Lady Ursula's letter had not mentioned, but that Perrin, who gathered information the way other men gather receipts, had mentioned to her in the form of a name. Miss Helena Staverton, who had accepted the Duke of Chasewood's proposal in the spring of 1814 and declined to marry him 6 weeks later. In a letter that had been widely summarised in the drawing rooms of London that season as proof that the Duke, for all his estate, was a cold man and a dull one. She had heard this already from Mrs. Alcott, who had it from the Granthams, who had it from everyone. She had accepted it as social wallpaper. Now, looking at the careful way he turned his hat in his hands and did not ask her to be grateful, she thought, he did not become cold, he became careful. There is a difference, and someone who was careless with him once does not get to call it a flaw in him. She did not say any of this. She said, I accept. Have your solicitor contact Walters on the High Street. He has handled Mrs. Alcott's affairs, and he knows how to be discreet. The Duke nodded, replaced his hat, and rose. At the door of the parlour he paused. You will want to write to Dorcas before Walters draws up the terms. If she has the documents you describe, we should have them in hand before anything is formalised. I was writing to her when you knocked, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was, she thought, the direction of one. He inclined his head and left. Cordelia stood in the parlour for a moment after the front door closed. Then she went back upstairs to the writing table, picked up her pen, and finished the letter to Dorcas. The real one this time. Not the burned versions, not the careful diplomatic versions that said nothing useful. She told Dorcas about the Duke of Chasewood, about his great-aunt's intelligence, about Slade and the crown. She told her about the terms. She told her to send the tapestry bag with the contents intact, by the most reliable post she could arrange, to the white heir in Millbrook, care of Perrin, whose name she knew from the assembly, and whose discretion she was prepared to stake a great deal on. She sealed the letter with plain wax. She had no crest and had not used one in 16 years, and wrote Dorcas's Bath address in her small, upright hand. Then she sat for a moment, with the sealed letter between her hands, and looked at the writing table's surface. The household accounts in their leather folder. The tin box with her father's seal. And in the corner, where the two gloves had rested together for 3 years, the single remaining glove lying on its side. She would have to ask him to return it, at some point. She was not yet sure how to ask a man who had kept a woman's lost glove in his breast pocket for a week, without explaining why. Outside, on the Millbrook High Street, the clock above the Guildhall struck 11, and somewhere across the market square, in the Crown's low-ceilinged taproom, a man named Slade was finishing a second breakfast and deciding that the companion on Holt Lane had gone to ground long enough that it was time to find out exactly where she was spending her mornings. They were married on a Tuesday, 11 days after the assembly, in the small church on Millbrook's East Road, with Perrin as witness and Mrs. Walters, the solicitor's wife, as the second. The ceremony took 20 minutes. The register was signed with a clerk's pen that needed redipping twice. Cordelia wore her green wool travelling dress, the better of her two, and carried no flowers, having no garden to take them from, and no inclination toward performance. The Duke wore the same dark coat she had first seen him in. Afterward, he handed her into the carriage with the same courtesy he would have shown a woman he had known for 20 years, and Perrin secured the door, and Millbrook receded behind them as the horses found their pace on the Bath Road. Mrs. Alcott had been told. She had taken the news with a long pause and then said, with the philosophical resignation of a woman who knows she will need a new companion, that she supposed it was all very sudden, and had Cordelia thought about the winters because grand houses were always cold. The winters. Chasewood Manor, when they arrived on the second day at 4:30 in the grey November light, was cold, in the way that buildings are cold when they have been maintained without being inhabited, cleaned, aired, swept, but not warmed. The heat of fires kept to minimum economy rather than to comfort, the rooms carrying the particular chill of spaces that have forgotten why they were built. It was a large house, 3 main floors of pale Bath stone, 2 wings added in the previous century, a formal garden that had been kept tidy and expressed in its tidiness no pleasure in itself. The entrance hall had a chessboard floor of black and white marble, and a staircase of carved oak that rose in 2 flights to a landing where a full-length portrait of the 4th Duke looked down with the expression of a man who considered optimism a personal failing. Mrs. Beale was waiting at the door. She was a compact woman of 60, with white hair pulled back with the precision of someone who regards loose ends as a moral failing, and she had been housekeeper at Chasewood for 31 years. Which meant she had been there longer than the current Duke had been alive. She had managed the house through his father's long withdrawal from society and through the years of the Duke's own managed solitude. And she had developed in that time a quality that was not quite approval and not quite judgment, but existed somewhere between them. A watchful neutrality. The posture of a woman who has seen a great deal of domestic theatre and maintains reserves of both warmth and scepticism, to be deployed in proportions determined by events. She looked at Cordelia for approximately 3 seconds. Then she said, "Your Grace, welcome to Chasewood. If you'd care to see the house before dinner, I can take you through the east rooms now, or after, as you prefer." "After," Cordelia said. "But I would like to see the housekeeper's book for the last 6 months this evening, when you have a moment." A pause of approximately 1 second. Then, "Of course, Your Grace." This was the beginning of what became, over the following fortnight, a quiet reorganisation of Chasewood's domestic arrangements, conducted without drama or announcement, but with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 3 years managing a household on £11 per annum, and now had access to an establishment with an actual budget and actual staff. The formal dining table, a mahogany monstrosity intended to seat 24, which the Duke had been eating at alone at one end for 4 years, was reduced in length by removing the 2 middle leaves and replacing them in the service passage. A standing order for fresh flowers was placed with the kitchen garden, and when the kitchen garden produced nothing suitable in November, Cordelia bought dried lavender and rose hips from the market in the village and arranged them herself in the corridor vases, which had been holding nothing but dust and expectation. Tom, the young footman, was 20 years old and had come to Chasewood 6 months prior from a family of 9 in the village, which meant he was accustomed to noise and chaos and found the manor's silence faintly oppressive. He had a broad, good-natured face and the kind of careful politeness that overlies genuine shyness. And he responded to Cordelia's matter-of-fact requests with an alacrity that Mrs. Beale observed once from a doorway, with an expression she quickly arranged into neutrality. He was the one who helped Cordelia carry the small upholstered stool from the study landing to the library, and who held the upper end of the heavy velvet curtain in the east corridor while she rehung it on its track, and who found her, one cold Saturday morning, standing in the doorway of the room that had been closed. It was in the east wing, on the 2nd floor, its door not locked, but latched in a way that suggested it had not been opened for some time. A sitting room, with windows looking over the formal garden, furnished in faded rose and ivory, with a small writing desk of satinwood under the window, and a low chair beside the empty grate, and watercolour studies on the walls. 3 of them. Landscapes of a chalk hillside in summer, done in the uncertain hand of someone who had painted for pleasure and not for skill. The velvet on the chair was rubbed thin at the armrests. On the writing desk, a small silver ink pot, tarnished to near black, and beside it a book, a collection of verse, its spine cracked with use, left open at a page, face down, as if the reader had stepped out and expected to return. No one had returned. The Duke's mother had died when he was 6 years old, and the room had been shut and left. Cordelia stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she stepped inside, crossed to the window, and opened the curtains. November light came in, thin, grey, but light, and fell across the dusty watercolours, and the tarnished ink pot, and the turned-down book on the desk. She had Tom bring cleaning cloths and a brush for the grate, and she spent 2 hours in the room that afternoon. And by the time she was done, it was clean and light and still. And the book had been closed and set upright on the desk, its page marked with a ribbon she had taken from her own workbox. Pale blue, a colour she had chosen for no reason she could have articulated. The following evening she moved the armchair. It was a large chair, upholstered in worn green leather, which had stood for years at a diagonal in the corner of the library farthest from the fire. She and Tom shifted it to a position 6 feet from the hearth, angled toward the fire but also toward the room, so that a person sitting in it would have warmth at their face and the library at their back rather than a wall. She left it there and went to bed. She did not see the Duke's face when he came to the library that evening and found the chair moved. She heard about it later, obliquely, from Mrs. Beale, who mentioned in the course of a conversation about the kitchen accounts that His Grace had sat by the library fire for 2 hours after dinner rather than his usual 40 minutes, and had asked for a second pot of tea, which he had not done in the 4 years Mrs. Beale had kept account of his habits. The letter from Slade arrived on a Wednesday, folded inside an otherwise innocent-looking bill from a local supplier, addressed to her by her married name, which told her that Slade had her new name and her current address, which meant Horatio's reach was longer than the coaching inn at Millbrook. The letter was brief and precise in its ugliness. A reminder that certain legal arrangements concerning the Harton estate were already in motion. That a court's declaration of death could be a permanent thing, regardless of the subject's subsequent vitality, and that the simplest resolution for all parties would be a signed renunciation of claim, which Mr. Horatio Harton would receive with considerable relief, and even, the letter suggested, some financial generosity. She read it twice. She folded it once. She placed it between the pages of the household account book, between the October summary and the November projection, where it was very unlikely to be found unless someone was specifically looking for it. She told herself she would show it to the Duke's solicitor. She told herself she would mention it to the Duke directly. She did neither of these things that week, because she did not yet know how to tell the man she had been married to for a fortnight that she had brought his name into a conflict that might prove more difficult than she had represented. She was aware this was not rational. She was aware also that rationality was easier to maintain when one had not spent 16 years in a posture of self-sufficiency, so complete that the act of asking for help felt structurally identical to the act of confession. She told Mrs. Beale instead. It was not a planned confidence. She had gone to find Mrs. Beale about the kitchen arrangements, and she had found her in the small linen room off the service corridor, folding napkins with the meditative regularity of a woman who finds steady, repetitive work good for complicated thoughts. Cordelia sat on the low stool by the shelf and said something about the account book, and somehow the close, warm room, the smell of pressed linen, the unhurried quality of Mrs. Beale's folding, she kept talking past the account book into the thing underneath it. She talked about her father, Edmund Harton, who had died in a room not unlike this one in scale. A narrow room, late autumn light, a nurse and a small daughter at the bedside, and who had pressed a folded document into Dorcas's hands 4 days before the end, and told her to keep it until the right moment, whatever that required, and however long it took. She talked about Dorcas carrying the tapestry bag with the document sewn into its lining for 12 years across various Bath lodgings, and the letter that had reached Millbrook 2 weeks ago confirming the bag was on its way north. She talked about her father's face in the last week, the way he had looked at her, the specific quality of a parent's apology for something he had not yet done but already knew was coming. And she stopped talking because she had reached the end of it. Mrs. Beale folded a napkin. "The bag has arrived, Your Grace," she said. "It came while you were in the village yesterday. His Grace signed for it." Cordelia turned her head. "I left it in his study," Mrs. Beale said. "I thought he'd know what to do with it." What the Duke had done with it, Cordelia discovered when she came to the library that evening, was place it on the table beside the moved armchair with a note in his neat hand. "Arrived this afternoon. Tell me when you're ready to open it, and I'll have Walters here by the end of the week." She stood holding the note for a moment. The tapestry bag was small and old. Its green and gold flowers faded to the colour of something that had once been bright, and it sat on the table in the library's firelight as if it had been waiting a long time to arrive here and was in no particular hurry now. She did not yet know that the Duke had been in the corridor outside the linen room that afternoon, having come to find Mrs. Beale about a separate household matter, and that he had stood in the corridor for 4 minutes without opening the door. She did not know what he had heard. He said nothing about it to her that evening or in the days that followed, and she would only understand later that this was not indifference, but its opposite, that he had heard her describe her father's last week in a narrow room, and had recognised in it the particular weight of something carried alone for a very long time, and had decided that the most useful thing he could do was put the tapestry bag where she would find it and leave the door open. London arrived like a change of weather. Chasewood had been cold and adjustable. London in the season was a different kind of cold. Social, tactical, performed in drawing rooms and opera boxes, and the carefully managed neutrality of Allmax voucher holders. They arrived in the last week of January, when the city's social mechanisms were beginning their annual acceleration, and word of the Duke's unexpected marriage had preceded them by approximately 6 weeks, which was enough time for the story to have acquired several additions it had not started with. Cordelia was aware of the additions. She heard them first at Allmax. The patronesses had issued vouchers without comment, since refusing admission to a duchess would have been socially catastrophic, regardless of opinion. But opinion moved through the assembly rooms in the form of a particular quality of pause in conversation when she entered. A certain arrangement of shoulders, the way 2 women near the door continued talking as she passed, with a fluency that indicated they had not been saying the same thing a moment before. She catalogued this without surprise. She had expected it. She wore the ivory silk she had made in Bath, not extravagant but well cut, with the clean line of a woman who knows what suits her rather than what impresses. And she kept her expression pleasant and her responses to inquiry precise and her hands entirely steady. Lady Venetia Ashworth was 30, dark-haired, possessed of a beauty that was genuine, and a manner that had been polished to a finish so high it reflected everything, rather than absorbing it. She had, as Cordelia already knew from the dispatches of Lady Ursula, who had written twice since the marriage with the committed helpfulness of a woman who considers intelligence a form of affection, hoped to be the Duchess of Chasewood, and had managed that ambition with the particular discipline of a woman who never directly states what she wants, preferring to arrange the surrounding circumstances until the desired result appears to be everyone else's idea. The rumour at Allmax that the new Duchess was a common adventuress who had constructed a false history to catch a rich husband was not attributed to anyone in particular. It had arrived fully formed, as Venetia's operations generally did. The dinner party at Lord and Lady Forsyth's house in Grosvenor Square, 3 weeks into the season, was the night Venetia moved from rumour to direct engagement. She waited until the women had withdrawn from the table and the conversation had reached a particular configuration. Several women listening, several more within earshot, Cordelia isolated at one end of the circle by the fireplace. And then she said, in the pleasant tone of someone asking an innocent question. "I wonder, Your Grace, whether anyone in your family has been presented before. I ask because I confess I find it difficult to place your connections." The room did not go quite silent. It contracted. The conversation around the edges thinned without stopping. Cordelia set down her coffee cup. She looked at Venetia directly. Then she said, "My mother was Charlotte Whitmore before her marriage, and before that a Beaumont on her mother's side. My father was Edmund Harton of Harton Hall, Somerset, seated there for 6 generations." She paused. "The glove I wore to the Millbrook assembly in November, the one my husband found on the floor and has kept since, carries the Harton running heart worked in silver at the wrist. It was made in 1790 on Bond Street as a wedding gift for my mother." Another pause, smaller. "If you have difficulty placing my connections, Lady Ashworth, I would be happy to write them down for you." Venetia said nothing. This was itself notable. Venetia, in Cordelia's experience of the preceding weeks, always had something to say. The room's contracted attention released. 2 women near the window exchanged a glance that communicated satisfaction without requiring words. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Horatio Harton's solicitor. It offered £800 and a written renunciation of all past injury in exchange for Cordelia's formal surrender of claim to the Harton estate and its title. £800, which was, Cordelia noted with a coldness she didn't show anyone, approximately 1/15 of the estate's annual income. She wrote back, in her own hand, on cream paper with the Chasewood crest, in 4 sentences. She declined. She told the Duke about the letter that evening. He read it once, set it face down on the table between them and said, "Walters has the will now. We can begin proceedings within the month." "I know," she said. "You should have shown it to me the week it arrived." She looked at her hands, both of them, the bare right and the gloveless left, and thought about the account book where the first letter still sat between October and November. "Yes," she said. "I should have." He did not say anything else about it. He picked up the letter and took it to add to the file Walters was building. And she watched him cross the room and thought about the green and gold tapestry bag on the library table at Chasewood, waiting to be opened, and about all the things they had both been carrying alone for a long time. And about how still strange it was, how unexpectedly complicated, to find at 24, in a marriage she had entered as a legal arrangement, that another person's habits of care had begun to feel like something she did not want to account for in practical terms. She did not account for them. She folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the London street, and the carriages moved past in the cold, and across the room the Duke was filing a letter that had been written to frighten her, and neither of them said what they were thinking. And the gap between what they were thinking and what they said had become, without either of them planning it, the most consequential distance in the room. The proceedings began formally on a Thursday in the first week of February, when Walters presented the will, which Dorcas had carried for 12 years sewn into the lining of a tapestry bag, protected by nothing more elaborate than old thread and an old woman's stubbornness, to a judge in chambers. The document was 3 pages in Edmund Harton's hand, signed before 2 witnesses, and left the whole of Harton Hall and its dependent lands and income to his daughter Cordelia without qualification or condition. It had been written 4 days before his death, and Horatio Harton had known of its existence for 12 years, and had proceeded as though it did not exist, which was the simplest possible definition of what he had done, and also, Walters said, with the measured understatement of a man who had long since run out of capacity for surprise, deeply inadvisable. The process would take time. Walters said weeks, Cordelia understood months. She had waited 16 years, and she could wait more. And the will was in a judge's hands now. And Horatio's solicitor had gone very quiet, in a way that his own clients probably found instructive. None of this resolved anything about what lived between herself and the Duke in the London townhouse on Half Moon Street. It was a tall, narrow house, well furnished, maintained by a staff smaller than Chasewood's, and considerably more accustomed to the particular rhythms of a man who lived alone. Cook, whose full name was Mrs. Dora Hastings, and who had opinions about menus that she communicated with the directness of someone who considers ambiguity a form of rudeness. A housemaid named Clara, 17, whose natural expression was wide-eyed observation. Perrin, who moved through the house at all hours with his customary air of having anticipated the last 4 things to happen and was already considering the next 4. The Duke's study was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the street. A room of dark green walls and ordered bookshelves and a writing table with a lockbox in the lower drawer, beside which, on the table's surface, a small brass dish held the Daily Post, and occasionally, as Cordelia had observed in passing, without comment, one pale kid leather glove, worn at the thumb, lying folded with the careful attention of something set down deliberately rather than simply left. She had not asked for it back. She had the right-hand glove at Half Moon Street, wrapped in the same cloth it had travelled in since Millbrook, stored in the flat-lidded box on her dressing table beside her mother's garnet earrings and a pressed sprig of the rosemary from Chasewood's kitchen garden that Tom had brought her on the morning they left for London. She thought about asking him to return the left one. She found, each time the thought arrived, that she was in no particular hurry. It was his now, in some way she didn't have a precise accounting for. The day before Lady Jersey's ball, he came to find her in the morning room where she was writing letters. He stood in the doorway for a moment, which she had learned was his way of offering her the option to be busy, and she looked up. "Lady Ursula will be there tomorrow," he said. "She has decided to come down from the country specifically, which means she expects something to happen. She has not told me what." "Lady Ursula has more intelligence than either of us, and considerably less patience," Cordelia said. "That is probably not an accident." He stepped into the room. There was a pause of the kind that had become familiar between them. Not uncomfortable, but weighted, carrying something neither of them had yet chosen to unpack in full. "Do you want the glove? Before tomorrow?" She set down her pen. She considered him, the way he stood beside her writing table with his hands at his sides, and his expression giving nothing away except the attention he was always paying, the quality of focus that she had stopped mistaking for coldness approximately 6 weeks into their marriage. "No," she said. "Keep it." He looked at her for one moment, then he nodded, once, and left the room. And she picked up her pen and looked at the half-finished letter in front of her, and did not immediately return to it. She wore ivory again to Lady Jersey's ball, but a different ivory, heavier silk, with a narrow border of cream embroidery at the hem, that Clara had pressed that morning, with the concentration of someone who understood that the state of a garment's hem was a form of argument. Cordelia dressed without ceremony, pinned her mother's garnet earrings at her ears, and put on her right-hand glove and her other glove, plain white kid, purchased in London. A match for nothing except the evening's convention. Then she removed the plain white glove from her left hand and folded it into her evening bag. She went down the stairs, carrying the left side of herself bare. Lady Jersey's house in Berkeley Square was lit from the inside out, the tall windows throwing amber light across the wet stone of the pavement and the row of carriages that had been depositing guests since 9 o'clock. Sarah, Lady Jersey, patroness of Almack's, social authority of the first order, a woman who had been called capricious by people who found her inconvenient and perceptive by everyone who looked more carefully, received guests in a hall hung with pale gold damask and furnished with long-stemmed hothouse roses in white and deep coral, filling the air with the dense sweetness of flowers that had no business blooming in February and were doing it anyway. Her greeting to Cordelia was neither warm nor cold. It was precise. The greeting of a woman who has suspended final judgment in a case that has not yet reached its conclusion and intends to be watching when it does. The Duke's hand was at the small of her back as they moved into the first reception room. Not a possessive pressure, a light touch, contact made and maintained. The kind of navigation gesture between two people who have learned each other's physical presence in a shared house over months. She felt it, and was aware of feeling it, and had stopped some weeks ago pretending she wasn't. Lady Ursula was already there, installed in a chair near the fireplace in the inner drawing room, with the authority of a woman who arrives early to every engagement because she refuses to make an entrance and also refuses to stand. She was small, white-haired, wearing black silk with a cameo brooch at her throat that depicted a scene Cordelia had once, on closer inspection, identified as Odysseus and Penelope, which she suspected was not accidental. She looked at Cordelia for a long moment when they reached her. "You look like your mother," she said. "Sit down and tell me about Walters." Cordelia sat. The Duke went to speak with Lord Forsyth, who had appeared at his elbow, and she told Lady Ursula about Walters in the direct style Lady Ursula preferred. The will, the judge, the timeline, Horatio's solicitors knew silence. Lady Ursula listened with her chin slightly raised and her eyes moving occasionally across the room as she did so, monitoring the social landscape with the peripheral competence of someone who has spent 81 years learning to listen and look at the same time. "His solicitor's silence," Lady Ursula said, "is because two of Horatio's witnesses to the supposed death declaration have withdrawn their sworn statements in the last 10 days. I know this because one of them is Mrs. Carrow's brother-in-law, and Mrs. Carrow told me on Tuesday. The other I know through means that need not be specified." She patted Cordelia's hand once. "It is progressing." Venetia arrived at 10:30. She wore deep blue, sapphire, almost exactly the blue of the ballroom's painted ceiling, and she carried a painted fan of ivory sticks and silk leaves that she opened and closed with the particular rhythm of a woman who is working out her timing. Cordelia observed her arrival from across the room and understood, with the clarity of someone who has been watching Venetia operate for the better part of a season, that the fan's rhythm meant she had already decided what she was going to do and was determining when. The answer was 11:30, when the dancing was between sets and the company was in the pleasant, loosely distributed state that follows a good cotillion, and the Duke was 20 feet away in conversation with Lord Forsyth and a second man Cordelia didn't know, and Lady Jersey was within sight but not within immediate conversational range. The women near the fireplace, 4 of them, good listeners, well-placed, provided the audience. Venetia moved through the room with the deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed the choreography. She stopped near the fireplace. She held up the fan in her left hand, and with her right she produced from her evening bag something small and pale and folded. The left-hand glove. Her mother's glove. The silver running hearts at the wrist. "I'm sure," Venetia said, in the pleasant tone of a woman expressing concern for the social order, "that someone should ask, because I find I cannot simply stay silent, about this glove, which was reported missing from Chasewood's London study 3 weeks ago, and which I have reason to believe the Duchess of Chasewood may have, I say this with all the hesitation it deserves, removed herself, some time before the Duke had occasion to notice. One wonders whether a woman who presents herself under one name and one history might not also—" "That," said the Duke, "is quite enough." He had crossed the room. She had not seen him move. He had been 20 feet away, and now he was here, beside her, and his voice carried the flat, complete certainty of a man who has chosen his words with precision and intends them to travel. The room had done the thing rooms do. The surrounding conversation had not stopped exactly, but it had thinned, the way sound thins when people are directing their attention somewhere specific. Lady Jersey had moved. She was now, Cordelia observed, approximately 8 feet away and entirely still. The Duke looked at Venetia Ashworth with the expression of a man completing a calculation he had been running for some time and had now arrived at the final figure. "I found that glove," he said, "on the floor of the Millbrook Assembly Room on the 14th of November last year, because the woman who wore it had cause to leave before she could retrieve it. I kept it because I did not know her name, and I did not know her history, and I found that I could not put it down." He paused. "I know her name, and I know her history now. I know them better than I have known anything in my life. And if you are suggesting that the Duchess of Chasewood is not who she says she is, you are suggesting that I do not know my own wife. The implications of that suggestion regarding your judgment, Lady Ashworth, I will leave you to work out." Venetia's fan had stopped its movement. Her expression had the quality of a woman who has committed to a course of action that is no longer serving its intended purpose, and has not yet found a way to change direction gracefully. "Furthermore," the Duke said, and his voice changed. Not louder, not harder, but something in it opened that Cordelia had not heard before, or had not heard addressed to a room of this size. "I kept the glove because I was not willing to give it up. I want that stated clearly, since we are stating things. I married her not for her history, and not for her name, and not for the convenience it might afford either of us, but because I love her. And any attack on her character is answered directly by me, at whatever length and in whatever forum is required." The room was, for 3 full seconds, entirely quiet. Then Cordelia raised her left hand. She held it up, not dramatically, simply up, where the firelight caught it, where the right-hand glove's silver thread at the wrist caught the light and ran, the small linked hearts open at the top, each one mid-stride, the exact image of the glove the Duke held in his hand. The pair of them, separated since November, matching across the distance of the room. "My name is Cordelia Harton," she said. "I am the daughter of Edmund Harton of Harton Hall, Somerset, who died in November of 1807, who wrote a will 4 days before his death, leaving the estate in full to me, and who was robbed of that intention by his younger brother, Horatio Harton, who had me removed from the house at 8 years old and subsequently declared dead, the declaration being false and the declaration being known to be false by several parties, 2 of whom have already withdrawn their sworn testimony in the preceding 2 weeks." She looked at Venetia directly. "The gloves were my mother's. They were made in 1790 on Bond Street for her wedding. I have had the right-hand glove for 16 years. My husband has had the left one since November, because I left it on the floor of a country assembly room when I was frightened, and he picked it up and kept it." She paused. "The Harton crest has been entered into the court record in connection with my father's will, which is currently before a judge, and the proceedings are expected to conclude within the quarter. If there is anything else you would like to have clarified, Lady Ashworth, I am available." Venetia said nothing. Her face held the arrangement of a woman maintaining composure over an outcome that has not gone as planned, and she maintained it with the discipline she had always had. But the room had already decided. Lady Jersey crossed the remaining 8 feet and stood beside Cordelia, which was not nothing. Lady Jersey standing beside you, in her own ballroom, was approximately equivalent to a declaration of allegiance read into the public record, and said, in a voice pitched to carry the precise distance she intended it to carry, "I believe the next set is forming. Duchess, will you lead it?" She danced with the Duke. It was a waltz. Lady Jersey had introduced waltzing at Almack's against considerable opposition some years prior, and she scheduled it deliberately, at key moments in an evening, with the tactical instinct of a woman who understands that music and movement can perform functions that conversation cannot. The room was warm from candles and company, and the heat of the adjacent ballroom. The Duke's hand was at her waist, and his other hand held hers, and he looked at her with the expression she had been learning to read for months. The specific quality of his attention that meant he was not performing, not managing, not calculating, but simply present. "I should have told you sooner," she said. The music had them. "That I know what the glove meant to you." "You knew?" "I walked past your study enough times." He was quiet for a turn. "I should have asked you properly," he said, "rather than putting things in front of you and waiting for you to decide what they meant." "I prefer being left to decide," she said. "I know. I was also afraid." He said it the way he said most true things, directly, without softening, as though the most accurate statement was also the most useful one. "I am not afraid now." She turned her face up toward his for a moment, a small, deliberate angle. Around them, the other couples moved, and the candles moved, and the pale gold walls of Lady Jersey's ballroom held all of them together in warm, unremarkable light, and none of it was performing anything for anyone. This was simply what was true, moving in three-quarter time. They stayed until the last set was called. They were watched, throughout the evening, with the particular quality of attention that follows a public reversal of opinion. Not prurient, but observant. People recalibrating their understanding of what they were looking at. Several women spoke to Cordelia who had not spoken to her before. Lord Forsyth asked the Duke something that made him laugh, which caused Lord Forsyth to look pleased with himself. Lady Ursula, from her chair, watched the room with the satisfied expression of a woman who had travelled a considerable distance to see a specific thing happen, and had seen it. At midnight, Cordelia retrieved her evening bag from the cloakroom. She put her plain white left-hand glove back on. It was cold outside, and practical, and looked for a moment at her right hand, at the silver hearts worked at her wrist, running their endless small circuit in the candlelight of the hall. She folded her fingers closed. She went to find the Duke. In the carriage, on the way home through the February streets, they sat across from each other, in the dark and the warm and the rolling quiet of the city at midnight. The Duke held the left-hand glove in his hand. He had taken it back after the confrontation, and she had let him. And he turned it once, slowly, in the way she remembered from the very first description Perrin had given her. A man who had found something and could not put it down. She could feel the shape of what remained unsaid between them, heavy and something she had not yet named aloud. And she was aware, with the particular clarity that comes after a long, public, consequential evening, that she was done with leaving things unnamed. "I know what I want to say," she said. "I have known for some weeks. I have been deciding whether to say it." The Duke looked at her. The carriage moved through the dark city with its lanterns and its wet stone and its indifferent February night. And inside, the small space held them both with their ordinary human imprecision. "You have been deciding," he said. "I find decisions benefit from deliberate consideration." "You do." "I love you," she said. "I thought you should know that directly. You said it in a room full of people, which was very like you, and I am saying it in a carriage at midnight with no audience, which is very like me, and both are equally true." He was very still for a moment. Then he reached across the space between them and took her right hand, the gloved one, the silver hearts at the wrist, and held it with the careful firmness she had first noticed on an assembly floor 6 months ago. "Yes," he said quietly. Both are equally true. They did not say anything else for the remainder of the drive. There was nothing else that needed saying. The carriage turned into Half Moon Street, and the horses slowed, and Perrin opened the door with his customary timing, and they went inside. And the house was warm and dark and theirs. The weeks that followed had a different quality from everything that had preceded them. Not easier precisely. The legal proceedings were not simple, and Horatio's solicitor had apparently decided that obstruction was a sufficient strategy. And there were 3 further letters of varying degrees of unpleasantness that arrived from that quarter before matters concluded. But easier within. The way a room is easier to move through when the furniture has been placed where it should be, and you no longer need to calculate the path in the dark. Walters came to Half Moon Street on the 12th of February with the expression of a man carrying news he has been rehearsing how to deliver. He sat in the front parlour and accepted tea and declined a second cup, and then said, with the controlled satisfaction of a solicitor who has been personally invested in an outcome while maintaining all professional decorum, 2 of Mr. Horatio Harton's witnesses have now withdrawn. A third has declined to testify at all, on advice of his own counsel. Mr. Harton's solicitor has filed for a postponement, which has been denied. He paused. The will is valid. The judge has returned his preliminary opinion. I expect formal judgment within the fortnight. Cordelia set down her cup. She looked at Walters, a mild, careful man of 50 who wore a brown coat and had always treated her affairs as though they mattered as much as a duke's, which was not something every solicitor would have done, and said, "Thank you, Walters, for the speed of it." The document was unambiguous, he said. A clear will is its own argument. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. I should note that Mr. Horatio Harton has vacated Harton Hall as of last Wednesday. His personal effects were removed. The staff that remained, there are 4, after the general reductions of the past several years, have been informed that their positions are secure under new management. I took the liberty of telling them that directly. She had not expected to feel what she felt at that, which was not triumph. Triumph implied a contest where winning was the point, and this was not a contest, it was a correction. But something quieter. The specific settling of a long-held tension, the way a joint aches less after it is finally set properly. 16 years was a very long time to spend waiting for a fact to be acknowledged as a fact. The hall will need considerable attention, Walters added. Mr. Harton's management of the estate accounts was not careful. I know, she said. I will see it when it is ready to be seen. The formal judgment came on the 28th of February, a Monday, with rain on the windows of the Half Moon Street parlour, and a fire that had been lit since early morning because Clara had noticed the weather and acted accordingly. Walters sent a brief note in his own hand, delivered by a boy at 11 o'clock. The Duke brought it to her himself from the front hall, a single folded sheet, unsealed, 4 lines. She read it once. The Harton estate, with all its lands and income and the hall itself, was hers. She held the letter for a moment. Then she set it on the writing table and pressed her hands flat on the surface and looked at the window and the rain and thought about her father, who had written 3 pages in a failing hand and left them in Dorcas's keeping because he had trusted, even at the last, that the right moment would come. She thought about Dorcas, who was not well enough to travel now, but who had sent a letter that had arrived the previous week, written in the cramped, arthritic hand of a woman declining slowly and with great composure, saying that she was glad and that she was comfortable and that Charlotte's girl had done everything right. She thought about the 8 years she had spent at Harton Hall before she was removed from it, the chalk hillside behind the house in summer, and the way the morning light came through the east windows, and the sound of her father reading aloud in the library on winter evenings, his voice carrying to the nursery above. She was going back, Not to a house that belonged to someone else, not to a house she was visiting, but to the house itself, as it had always been, as it always should have been. The Duke was watching her from the doorway. He said nothing, which was correct of him. There was nothing to say that would add to the fact. And he knew this, which was one of the many reasons she had married him. "We should go to Chasewood first," she said, after a moment. "Before the hall. There are things at Chasewood I want to settle properly." "Mrs. Beale will be glad to have us back," he said. "Mrs. Beale," Cordelia said, "will have the east wing opened and a dinner planned by the time we arrive. She knew before Walters did, I expect." He smiled at that, a full smile, unguarded, the kind she had been accumulating since the first slight direction of one at the door of Mrs. Olcott's parlour 6 months ago. This one she held. They left London on a Thursday, with the early March light still tentative in the mornings and a softening in the air that was not yet spring, but was considering it. The Bath road unrolled under the carriage wheels with the patience of a road that has carried a great many decisive journeys and has opinions about none of them. Perrin rode up with the driver and did not intrude upon the interior, having the instinct, developed over years of professional proximity to a man who valued quiet, to recognise when quiet was the appropriate offering. They talked and did not talk in the intervals that had come to feel natural between them. She told him about the chalk hillside, which she had been seeing in her mind since the Walters letter. The way it looked in August when the grasses went pale gold and the shadows moved across it in long sweeps as the clouds crossed. She had not described it to anyone before. It had been a private geography, held close. And she was discovering that the act of describing it to him was itself a form of returning. He listened in the way he listened to everything, fully, without interruption, without the anxious social performance of a man waiting for his turn to speak. He told her about the room in the east wing. He had not gone into it himself, he said, since she had opened the curtains. He had stood in the doorway once. The watercolours were his mother's, painted in the summer she was 22, 2 years before she married his father. He had been told this once, as a child, and had not confirmed it with anyone since. She was good, Cordelia said. The chalk hillside in the second one, she caught the light correctly. He looked at the window. Yes, he said, she was. Chasewood came into sight at 4 o'clock, the pale Bath stone warming in the afternoon light that had finally asserted itself against the morning's uncertainty. Cordelia had arrived here 4 months ago in November grey, the house cold and closed and meticulous in its silence. She saw it now with the slight adjustment of vision that comes after time and familiarity. The same stone, the same proportions, the same formal garden, but in the garden a row of early crocus had pushed through the dark soil along the south wall, purple and white, which no one had planted for years, and which had persisted anyway, with the stubbornness of living things that declined to take administrative silence for an answer. Mrs. Beale was at the door. She had, as Cordelia had predicted, the east wing open and a dinner arranged, and she received them with the particular warmth she permitted herself in moments of confirmed satisfaction. A warmth that expressed itself not in effusion, but in the precise rightness of every domestic detail. The fire in the main drawing-room already lit, the hall smelling of beeswax and fresh herbs from the kitchen garden, the arrangement of early flowers on the entrance table, that had not been there 4 months ago and was now simply part of how the house looked. Tom was behind her, holding the door open with the broad, unperforming pleasure of a young man who is glad that the people he works for have come home. He had, Cordelia observed, replaced one of the hall's old candle stands with a better one from the morning room, which she had once mentioned in passing showed the entrance to better advantage. He had remembered. She nodded at him, and he ducked his head, and grinned in the way of someone who has done a good thing, and is somewhat embarrassed by being noticed. After dinner, a dinner that had, in 4 months, changed from a formal performance at one end of a very long table into something that approximated what a dinner was meant to be. 2 people in a warm room with good food and the unhurried quality of an evening that has nowhere to be. She went to the east sitting room. She had a purpose. She had been carrying it since London, turned over in her mind at intervals, the way a small object is turned in a hand. The question of what to do with the gloves now that they were whole again. Both of them. In the same household. In the same rooms. The left one returned to her in the carriage the night of the ball. The small frame had been in the east sitting room since she cleaned it. It had sat on the writing desk of satinwood, under the window, holding nothing. It was an oval frame of dark-stained wood, the kind made to hold a miniature portrait, approximately 3 inches across. The Duke had moved a miniature from it when she restored the room, a small painting of a woman in pearl earrings that she later understood was his mother, which he had placed in a glass case in the library, where it could be seen rather than stored. The frame had remained on the desk, empty, waiting with the patience of objects for someone to understand what they were for. She carried it downstairs to the drawing room and stood before the fireplace. The fire was steady and low, the kind that has been burning long enough to settle into itself, the larger logs reduced to solid, concentrated heat and the occasional quiet collapse of embers. The mantelpiece was marble, pale grey-veined, and on it sat the things that had accumulated there over 4 months of her occupying this house. A small brass clock that had been wound and not wound in alternating years for a decade and now ran continuously. A sprig of dried rosemary in a narrow glass bottle, a smooth river stone she had brought from the garden without particular reason, simply because its grey-blue colour pleased her. She stood before it and took both gloves from her pocket. The Duke came in from the library. She heard him cross the hall, and he came to stand behind her, not intruding, simply present, as he was in most things. She placed the gloves in the frame. They were too large to lie flat inside it. They were gloves, not miniatures, not made for this purpose, but folded small, with the wrists arranged so that both running heart borders showed at the top edge. They fit within the oval's curve with the slight imprecision of something placed where it was meant to be, rather than where it was designed for. The silver thread caught the firelight. The small, open hearts, running, linked together, caught the light. She set the frame on the mantelpiece, between the clock and the river stone. His arm came around her. She felt the weight of it, familiar, certain, the press of his coat sleeve against her shoulder. They stood before the fire in the drawing room of the house that had been cold when she came to it, and was not cold now, and the crocus were pushing through the garden's dark earth outside the windows, and somewhere down the service corridor, Mrs. Beale was finishing the evening accounts with the satisfaction of a woman whose house is in order. And the fire crackled once, a low, settling sound, and the silver hearts at the wrist of both gloves ran and ran, caught in the same light, going nowhere, and arrived.